I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writer's House, where I have the pleasure of convening three friends in the world of contemporary poetry and poetics to collaborate on a close but not too close reading of a poem. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, and perhaps open up the verse to a few new possibilities, and we hope gain for a poem that interests us, some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because PoemTalk poems are available in recordings made by the poets themselves as part of our Pen Sound archive, which is not quite true about this poem, but we'll talk more about that. Writing.upenn.edu/pensound. Well, once again, PoemTalk has gone on the road, this time to Montreal, where Erín Moure has kindly agreed to host us in her lovely, cozy apartment. And for this special episode, I'm joined by Deanna Fong, a critic and scholar widely published, a doctoral candidate in English at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, where her research focuses on audio media, event theory, literary communities, and affective labor. A key member of the federally funded Spoken Web project. Do we say federally funded?
I guess
for
we
Canada?
do.
Yes,
true.
and Spoken Web, and the project is a consortium maker, I guess, in process of audio poetry archives, who with several others co-directs the audio multimedia archive of Canadian poet Fred Waugh, and who has been cataloging the audio archives of Japanese-Canadian poet and painter Roy Kiyuka. And by Karis Shearer, director of the AMP, we say AMP, not AMP, lab, and associate professor of English at the University of British Columbia at Okanagan, who also directs the Soundbox, a collection of literary audio recordings from the 1960s through the 90s, originally on reels, and Karis's favorite material mode, cassettes, who is collaborating with Deanna on research into the Vancouver literary community of the 60s and 70s, and who recently co-authored with Deanna, the same Deanna, a piece called Gender Affective Labor and Community Building Through Literary Audio Artifacts, and whose awesome and intimidating Strava page, which I follow daily, consistently motivates me to get away from my desk and run, bike, or row. And by the aforementioned generous host of today's episode, Erín Moure, eminent Canadian poet and translator of poetry, most notably that of Galician poets, among them Rosalia de Castro, whose recent works include the play poem cabaret Capusta, did I pronounce that right? 2015. Planetary Noise, great book, the poetry of Erín Moure, which is selected poems, published by Wesley in 2017. Her translation of Wilson Bueno's Paraguayan Sea, Nightboat, 2017, a finalist for a 2018 Best Translated Book Award, and a 30th anniversary reissue of Furious. Turning Point book, Anansi, 2018, and whose new work, The Elements, being published by Anansi in Toronto, will appear in 2019. Erín, thank you once again for hosting us.
It's my pleasure. I get all you into the house.
I know, it's great. This is a great spot for a PoemTalk. Karis and Deanna, in one way or the other, well, you especially, Karis, traveled a long way to get here, so thank you for doing that.
My pleasure.
And Deanna, thanks for joining us.
Also a pleasure.
This is great. Well, the four of us are here today to talk about a poem by Maria, formerly known more as Gladys Hindmarch, who was at the center of the emerging avant-garde literary scene in the early 1960s, attended the 1963 Vancouver Poetry Conference, created interesting and important connections with Black Mountain poets, among many others, has published 3 books, poems in dozens of magazines, made audio recordings as a feminist, a materialist, and communitarian. The poem we're going to discuss now is currently still unpublished. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Titled Kitsilano, 1963-1969. Deanna and Karis have been preparing a collected works of Hindmarch for publication, and a few months before this gathering today made an 8-minute long recording of Hindmarch with her performing our poem. So here now is Maria Hindmarch reading Kitsilano, 1963 to 1969.
Okay. Kitsilano, 1963-69 for Judy Williams Fraser. 1963, I lived on the corner of U and York on the second floor above a corner store with my sister Lenny and boyfriend, soon-to-be husband, Neat Hoover, her friend, Joanne Huffman, and her boyfriend, Mike Sawyer. Then, Elsie Young, just left Robert, who became Ziza Wong. who met her lover, Jack Wise, next door. Then my sister Mary, and my boyfriend, soon to be later, Unby, husband, Cliff Anstey. Below us, Bill Bissett and Martina and Ulia, then painter jogger, Gordon Payne and Marilyn, who becomes my friend later. Then Bill again, then Gordon again. Next to us, Bing Tom, Jay Bancroft, and often Marion Penner, Rick Clark, across the landing, John and Susan Newlove, and children fathered by Jerry Gilbert, later the Ridgeways. And next to them, directly opposite us, Jerry Geisler, New Design Gallery, and Helen Sturry and children. Our kitchen faced theirs, apple pies in my oven, and stew or toast in theirs. We could smell everything, like the time we fell asleep as porthawks simmered in my big red pot, charred and burned and almost caught on fire. Would have if Jerry hadn't woken us up, and that building a total tinderbox. Always worried Bill would start one. My bedroom, study, faced the old Molson side and the Broad Street Bridge, and I could watch the West End and high-rises and the planetarium grow, and white sheets on a clothesline across the street dry. As I sit in my bay window and write and mark on a smooth board cut to fit exactly the sill, I glance up and see people like you and Jamie and Carol and Joan and Marcy and the Trumans and the Gads and the Lathams and Lanny Beckman walking up and down U Street. Open the window and shout, "Drop by on your way back." Dropping by, everybody did it. Days filled with coffee, tea, poetry, cigarette smoke, crises, trips, talk, painting hard-edged, strong-colored, also intricate silver point mandalas and collages. A gallon of Kelowna Red one summery Saturday night became a party of 100 or even more. Dancing in my bedroom to one music on a tape recorder, dancing in the other to another, drumming in the kitchen, talking in the room with the blue tile fireplace. So many bodies I couldn't hear the music from inside the hallway. Just saw the taller heads moving together to different beats in almost darkness. That crazy night at the Waz place, if it wasn't a party of this kind, that everybody landing on that bed, everybody kissing everybody, we had to go outside to pee. Something to do with that small space, that it was so tight that everybody had to rub everybody simply to go anywhere. It was gorgeous. After the Vancouver Poetry Conference, 1963, Roy Cayuca started dropping by. When he left his studio, there'd always be a light on somewhere in our building, and he could visit any of us, separately or clustered. One time he told me he had a painting he wanted to give me, but it was big and heavy. He borrowed a truck, and someone helped him up the dusty, always dirty long stairs with hoarfrost, which we hung on a wall in a room just big enough to hold my round oak table. Used to be the Bowerings. They bought a whole household of furniture for $80, and when they moved, they gave it to Joan, and then when she moved, she stored it with me. A wall that later Elsa and I tore apart with a screwdriver and a hammer, shouting angry hexes at Robert all the way. After and during that conference, Olson, Creeley, Duncan, Levertov, Avison, Whalen, Ginsberg, Roy and I became friends, and there were readings in my room every second Sunday. Red cast iron pot full of bean soup, corn chowder, spicy meatball, vegetable stew, simmering, and then cheese scones in the oven. People would come and read their new work one week, and the next week there'd be a Tisch meeting with Daphne Marlette, Dan McLeod, Pete Oxier, David Call, and David Dawson. Rent, $60 a month, didn't change. In some years it was cold, the wind so cold on the side facing the North Shore that hydro was $60 per month, and that wall frozen behind my pillows. The police were something else. They felt they had the right to question anybody. So Cliff would be up at the laundromat on 4th and just go to Jackson's to get some hamburger and be walking back with an economics book in one hand and meat wrapped in brown paper in the other. And they stop him and ask him what he was doing. And my friend Ray Wargo would get stopped almost every second time he'd drop in to visit. Where are you going? Why? How long will you be? Someone was always getting busted. Someone was always tripping out. Someone was always visiting from or going to Europe or Japan. Here is a journal entry on June 9th, evening of the first ever National Leaders Debate on TV. I'm looking forward to seeing Trudeau. Hope he gets pushed onto answering more directly than he has in the past. I, like many others, including every gay man I know, do have a crush on him. He has so much more style than any Canadian politician so far. I mean style in the true sense of the word. It is him, not affected. Cliff, of course, doesn't trust him at all and thinks he's a sellout. I don't go that far, but I do think that compromising is the only way a politician can work in this country. And I do not like all the PR razzmatazz, fundraising, and allegiances that go into just getting elected. Our system seems to be based on gullibility. Coming home at night, whether from downtown or the beach, or Paul the Butcher's, or Elsie's the bakers. I loved looking up at my north-facing windows. Goldy gold mesh curtains, light filtering through, so warm and so inviting.
There's so much we can talk about. I almost don't know where to start, but I'll just start somewhat arbitrarily by asking us to talk about the pronouns. It's an I poem, but it's also an us poem, right? Below us, our kitchen, and so forth. So, Karis, why is that important, if it is? I assume you think it's important.
Yeah, I do. And for Maria, I think, who was very much part of it, she was a community builder, an artist produced through community, right? And so one of the things I love about this poem is the way that it catalogs the community by naming people, person after person, and the sort of shifting relationships among them. Deanna, you've talked about this too.
Yeah, well, I think oftentimes when we use the first person plural pronoun in poetry, it can become very fraught because we don't know who we're talking about when we talk about we. We have a very concrete sense of who we're talking about here because Maria really goes to great lengths to really kind of list this community assemblage and all the people who are a part of it who sort of wander in and wander out, who are there across large swaths of time.
Oftentimes, Erín, when an I poem that's a documentary poem starts to switch to we feel somehow that a presumption is being made. How could this one I talk about everybody? But in this poem, I don't feel that concern somehow. How does she pull that off? I mean, I assume you agree that...
Yeah, I think it's partly through what Deanna just said about the naming, and even though the reader, I mean, I know who many of these people are, or came to know who many of these people are, but on the other hand, the reader might not know who any of them are. There is this kind of sense of the bringing together and kind of this effervescence of community during this process, in and through this process of creation, that makes that we, that really makes that we's inhabited by a lot of people and not just the author being presumptuous.
Yeah.
There's no sign, there's nothing presumptuous about that.
Yeah. Karis, you want to say more about that documentary poetics that makes we a natural thing rather than a how dare you talk for the rest of us thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things she's doing is she's highlighting the community connections, right? And we're seeing both the proximity of those bodies in the community through their connection through smell. So we have, a person who's smelling the burning pork roast on the stove, right? And they have to be close enough, living close enough to actually smell that. And so those connections come alive through that proximity, through, the catalog of names, the senses, the gifts that are given and exchanged through them, amongst them, the painting, the furniture. So you have this real sense, I think, of proximity through those little documentary moments.
Deanna, I know you've thought a lot about community, aesthetic communitarianism with its socio-political dimensions. The corner has become an important word. It was an important word in sociology and ethnography, maybe before we in our field realized its importance, but it's established right away in this poem. I lived on the corner of you and York, above a corner store. Can you riff on corner and the importance to the issues that are really of interest to you here?
Yeah, well, I think that the corner becomes a stand-in. It's like an interface, right, between these sort of domestic spheres and the sort of wider public, the community public. So it's a place where those two things meet in a kind of messy way. And again, that there are always people in flux, sort of coming in and out of that personal space, so that it's never a firm divide, but something that's very porous. And I think this is also something that we see at the end of the poem as well, maybe mirrored in the idea of the curtains, as the speaker is looking out and having these beautiful sort of golden wafting curtains in the light. But that's also the interface, right? Like that's the sort of sense of being home, but that home is surrounded by a community that the speaker is very deeply attached to and a part of.
I was so moved by the ending.
It's moving to think about that, to go back out to the what's outside, and we know there's a beach out there from the reading. We know there's a north shore, there's a shore, so that there's this kind of thing. When you're on a shore, there's a body of water, there's something else happening, there's a connection to this greater kind of cosmos.
Yeah.
So there's something cosmic about the ending of the poem to me.
Oh yeah, and a shift, not a shift, but another perspective. I mean, so much of this poem is, this was where we lived, and this is how we look outward from where we lived, that the community got created by a lot of people sharing food and partying and being together. And in the end, she's outside looking back up at the windows which she used to see out. So there's this fabulous, it's not an inversion, it's an expansion of the space. Yeah, Karis?
And she just leaves it with us.
Yeah, she does.
Yeah.
And it becomes more, pardon the word, more conventional lyric at the end, but it doesn't have the effect of a move toward something more conventional. In another poem, it really sort of seals the deal. Sorry.
No, I was just thinking, Kitsilano is a neighborhood, there's a corner, and the neighborhood is, in the community is built out from that. Erín, you used to live in this neighborhood, so you have a different connection to it from us, kind of slightly after.
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean, these people were from a generation older than me, but when I sort of hearing that this was going on in poetry and stuff like that was what brought me to Vancouver. And it was almost, I went to Vancouver in '74, so it was, these people had mostly moved, by then. But there was a lot of gentrification had started, and there was a lot of upward pressure on things, I guess. But I can see the corner. I can see that building. I know what it's like to live in one of those. They're like San Francisco apartment buildings where you can see the light under your neighbor's door and everything. Every time everybody goes, you can hear it in 3 apartments. So that there is no private life in a sense in that kind of surrounding, and which
is very positive in this poem.
Don't really. I think people absorb that, and in the poem too, it leaves us with this really sense not of poesis, like of the actual structure behind the scenes of a finished poem, the actual structure of making, and I think that's where what Deanna and Karis, when they're talking about effective labor and about things that go on behind the poem, it's not disconnected from the poem, it's absolutely connected with the process of making the poem.
I think you have a sense in this poem also that, it's not a nostalgic poem. It's not necessarily constructing, it takes great pleasure in community, in the proximity of bodies, in the small room where the bodies are squished together, and the sort of larger, the building where, you know, we can hear people, we can smell food, and the larger community, but it's aware that those communities are shifting, right? The relations between people among people are shifting. And we also have the presence of the police, right? And so there's that, you know, the police state, the state of the building being cold. I mean, we're aware of the threat and the gentrification and the things that will start to shift that community away from.
Yeah, watching the high rises grow on the skyline, which,
Yeah,
especially
in the West End across the way.
Mm-hmm.
We know more so who we are when we realize the things that are going to threaten the communitarianism that has, for the moment, been set up.
Mm-hmm.
Food, kitchens, domestic spaces, and art. I loved the thing about the pourcocks, which you definitely can smell almost from the poem, from the text.
Absolutely.
But then it turns out, parenthetically, we learn that they're being cleaned for an art project. Isn't that so fucking great?
Yeah.
So rather than being a criticizable cliche, oh, this is such a, you know, woman's approach to poetic communitarianism, you know, mentioning all the guys associated, of course women as well, associated with the famous Vancouver gathering, rather than feeling like, oh, too bad she's domesticizing the memories here, you feel somehow she's reminding us that art had to happen in that kind of, can the three of you talk about that, please? It's so important.
Yeah, well, I love the way that this gives cues, like in the language that it uses, it puts artistic production and domestic reproduction in really, really close proximity. So for example, like sort of on the second page there, where she's talking about hard edge painting, which is the style that Roy Kyoka painted in the late 50s and eventually gave up in the early 60s because he felt it didn't allow him to sort of express himself subjectively in the way that he wanted to. But so this sort of impersonal mode of painting is right up against talkity talk, right? And so that those things are never far away from one another. And so we can't think of artistic production as sort of happening elsewhere outside of the domestic sphere, our sort of private interactions. They're really deeply impressed upon by those activities. Kitty.
And I think it's true. I mean, thinking about
The cat it was a cue.
That was.
The cat's like, we're talking about the importance of spaces, human spaces, and the cat
wanted
starts
to jump on
meow.
me and she wouldn't let her,
I
so
know,
now you
well,
can listen to her.
That's fine. That's right. This is our penalty. Sorry, Karis.
No, that's okay. I was thinking, you know, to build on what Deanna was saying, the Vancouver Poetry Conference, you know, you have the public panels and the readings and the talks, but so much of what the participants, you know, migrate towards when they're reflecting on that conference is the parties and the sociality of it, and those conversations as really, you know, social conversations as really meaningful moments of connection where they got to exchange ideas, they got to make connections that would, you know, be friendships that would last long term.
Erín, this must really resonate with you, not necessarily about the Vancouver group, but just about the way you got into this in the first place and what attracted you to the sociality of experimenting in art.
Well, and sharing and just having, I wanted to have like great conversations with people and not just always be talking about banal things. And it just seemed, because I had read the first issues of the Capilano Review, and there was always interviews in the Capilano Review, and I mean, there's some interviews where Maria Hindmarch is there, Daphne Marlett, different people are talking about something, and they'd always be in somebody's house, just chatting and about things to do with poetry. And to me, it just seemed so rich and dynamic and full. And I mean, I knew they were another generation; they weren't going to invite me over to their house. But on the other hand, I wanted to be in the place where that was happening.
What did you get from it? And this is a tough question, but how did it affect the way, when you sat down the next morning to write your own poems, how did it affect you, that idea?
Well, I think it just put me in a place where poems mattered, because, I mean, where the space that I grew up in, I guess things mattered. I mean, Humpty Dumpty mattered and Robert Service mattered, but poetry didn't matter in the same way, you know, the White Cliffs of Dover and stuff. But I knew that all this was going on around me, and it was so rich. I mean, where I lived was in a building that was similar but even poorer to that building because we had shared washrooms. We didn't even, the little apartments didn't even have washrooms in them. And some of them did. Marion Penner's sister lived below me with her partner, Dennis Wheeler, who's a filmmaker. And so like there was always people coming in and out of my house too. And I don't know, it just made you think that art and making were worthwhile endeavors.
Deanna, I love the roster of the Vancouver people, but more importantly, it was her chance to meet Roy.
Yes.
And you've had kind of a critic's secondary excitement effect because you've been working with Roy Kiyuka stuff, and now you begin to realize that Hindmarch, that connection was important, and now you become, pardon me, you know, a scholar of Hindmarch. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about finding this poem and making the recording with Karis and Maria and all that stuff?
Yeah.
You need to know that.
Yeah, well, so actually I found Maria through Roy, too. It's an interesting connection because I was working with his audio archive at Simon Fraser, which one day just sort of like popped out of nowhere and was sitting on a table, and I was immediately drawn to them just as material artifacts, not having known a whole lot about Roy's poetry, but I knew immediately that I wanted to work with them simply because they were beautiful.
What was beautiful?
His handwriting,
yeah,
and these bizarre titles on the tapes too, like George Bowering is talking at Wiener Roast or whatever, you know, like, and I was like, I have no idea what could possibly be on these tapes, but I need to listen to them, which I did. And Maria features very, very prominently in that collection because she's also, you know, among other things, a really great conversationalist. And so she and Roy had this, you know, decades-long sort of intermittent conversation that is sometimes recorded on those cassettes.
And when did you find this poem? How?
Well, so basically we asked, you know, I interviewed Maria to talk about Roy's tapes and then just realized I was very, very interested in her work as well. So Karis and I decided that we would approach her to do the collected. And so she had a bunch of her writing that she hasn't published, and that she's got sort of binders by decade that she brought to her living room table or her dining room table and just let us sort of explore. And this poem, I think you were the one who found it actually.
I think so, yeah. And it just, well, like Kiyuka tapes, I mean, it just sort of jumped out as a documentary poem and something that was capturing that community behind, that community building process and the social energy behind the work.
And it's unpublished as of this recording, it's unpublished.
Well, it was written for Judy Williams Fraser, who's an artist. And it did appear in the 1990s, when it was written, in the Vancouver Art Gallery on curtains.
It has been published on curtains.
It has been published on curtains.
It's a great place to publish.
As an installation, you know, as part of an installation.
Right.
And so the curtains that figure at the end are also, you know, where those are not the curtains, but, you know, there's a kind of parallel between how they were first made public, the text was made public, and the curtains.
And you went to record this poem with her, and let's all four of us, I guess, think about what she did when she reread this poem. She probably hadn't reread in a long time.
Yeah.
What did she do?
Well, we were going to make the recording, and she said, I just want to take a second because I want to make sure that this relationship is clear, that this person is related to this person. And so she sort of started editing on the fly, I think because she just wanted to, you know, represent the community in a faithful way, in an ethical way.
She kind of updates information for us.
Definitely. So we did a lot of takes, and sort of the reading process also became something of an editing process as well.
Mm-hmm.
And you, Erín, while we were in the PoemTalk way of things, listening to the recording, we had a conversation which listeners to this recording won't hear. And Erín said, I noticed, I think it was you who said this, I noticed that the excerpt from her journal about the Trudeau stuff, Pierre.
Yeah, it's Pierre Elliott.
Yeah. She didn't alter. Why not?
Well, except that when she introduced it, she didn't say 1968, which is in the printed copy of the poem. So we could be talking about Trudeau Jr.
Yeah, but a kind of
It's
fealty
like-
to documentaryism. She really wanted to keep a quote from a journal intact.
But I think that's interesting, like these two kind of documentary formats, the documentary poem and then this insertion of a journal, which is a documentary kind of prose project, not meant for public consumption. But normally, like in documentary theater, the pieces are composed out of bits of journals and bits of interviews you did with people and bits of things people remember and this and that, so that the poem unfolds like that along its length, but it also has these depths that resonate in and out. That journal, the thing about the police, the whole history of the police and the counterculture in Vancouver and various other things, so that the poem's almost, it has these effects and these effects, so it's almost like it weaves a curtain.
And it's, I mean, we keep saying a poem, but Maria always corrects me when I say that because she thinks of it as a text. I think she would say that, a text.
Yeah.
Not a poem, is how she put it.
And once it's liberated from the you can't change it poem category, right, it becomes more of a witnessing document of the time, which she wants to have right, make right.
Yeah, and speak to the present moment as well, right, through these little iterative changes and footnotes, or not footnotes, but changes and clarifications.
But it sort of reminds me of the way, I mean, it is like a curtain, the poem, and that a curtain, if the wind is blowing, we identify as a curtain, but it's actually never visually the same because it's moving. And this poem moves like that too. And it reminds me of a definition of Chus Pato saying what stillness is in the poem is actually like the person who balances on the tightrope, dancer who's balancing on the tightrope, who's perfectly still, but actually is always moving.
Holy shit, Erín Moure, wait a minute. That was not only ridiculously brilliant in itself, but it's the ending of the poem.
Yeah.
She's really telling us at the end about how she means to be a witness to her own communality.
Well, also, if I just
As
say
an
one thing
aesthetic
about
matter.
the end of the poem, just because it sort of follows. She ends with the curtain, but in a documentary theater, of course, in theater, the curtain comes down at the end. The curtain closes off the scene at the end, and her curtain, at the end of the piece, the curtain opens out to the present, to us, to the, the view
Jesus, so
that's
we're
possibly out there.
situated here.
And I think that same instability of the text is also reflected in the instability of the relationships amongst the people, right? The community is always slightly shifting. People's names are changing. Someone is soon to be husband, then not unhusband, but
Soon to be and then unbe.
Unbe.
She says of her own.
Say that again.
She said the line is my boyfriend, soon to be, later unbe husband. So it's like got these three different or four different temporal relations just in that single sentence, trying to represent something that's, spanning across years and very, very dynamic.
I'm an idiot. I'm finally getting this. I really am finally getting this. Looking up at my north-facing windows, goldy gold mesh curtains. All I can think of is, ew, that's so dated, that style of curtain. On the other hand, and then my second thought is, this is what she wants. The $60 a month bohemianism of the corner, we should not sniff at from our much different way of inhabiting spaces as artists and intellectuals in cities that, in the case of Vancouver, have been prohibitively gentrified. She's saying, okay, sniff at the goldy gold mesh curtains in what would now be a $4,000 a month apartment. No, this is what I'm telling you about it, and you're going to be a witness to it too. You've got to be a witness to it too. So it's not just the Erín Moures who move out there in '74, but anyone who moves into an urban space, unfortunately probably not Vancouver because it's too expensive, but some other place, you get to be a witness to your own communitarianism, and that's the only way art's going to be made of this kind.
In a deeply tactile, material, sensory way.
Wow, okay, let's look at one change she made. When she got to someone, probably Dallas Selman, helped me do some moving. What was she doing? It was big and heavy. What was big and heavy? Oh, painting.
Hoarfrost.
Hoarfrost.
Right.
Yeah.
So she decided in the performance that you recorded. Someone, probably Dallas Selman. She eliminates that. Can we? Right. So, but maybe she's thinking, well, when I wrote this, I thought it was Dallas. Now I know it wasn't Dallas. Or why should I speculate? I don't know. How do you read that omission?
Well, there's a lot of possibilities. For one, she's as a prose writer, somebody who's very attuned to the rhythm of her speech when she performs aloud, and has really extensive performance notes about how she wants to read. And so it's possible that in the moment, it didn't quite seem to fit the sort of natural rhythm as it was unfolding, and she omitted it. Or it's also possible she was working from a different version of the text, and I can't quite recall which edited version we had used for this particular recording. So either one is possible, really.
Yeah. I really like the idea that the bearing witness is not very far underneath this whole gesture. Maria's recording for you. You're the two of you discovering or rediscovering this thing. Mm-hmm. Karis, you want to say more about the importance of the scholarly work that you're doing for the sake of this sociality and the affective labor that interests you so? I guess what I'm saying is I'm excited about the fact that you see your own role as a scholar, archivist, sound studies person as somehow creative, communitarian in itself. Does that make sense to you? And how close to that? How close to creative do you feel, even though you're just a tenured scholar?
Yeah. I think it's given me a way of seeing the conversation as a creative, critical mode in itself, and so that is a creative contribution, I suppose, on my part. And there's also the affective labor of, working with somebody and working in their archive and developing that level of trust. I mean, I've never lived in Vancouver. I've never lived in Kitsilano. I'm very unfamiliar with it except for through the literature and through the poetry. And one of the things that Maria has done for me is to take me to these neighborhoods and to drive around and say, this was Robert Creeley's house when he lived in Vancouver. This was Warren Tallman's house where we used to have these parties, and narrate that history in the present. And for me to receive that, I think, is also part of that work that we're doing. Mm-hmm. Deanna, do you want to say something about that as well? Because
Yeah, well, I think actually what we're doing with this collection is talking about differential ways of producing literature. Because I think there was because Maria's last book was published in 1988, and so there was a sort of perception.
Wow.
Yeah, Watery Part of the World was published in 1988, which you began writing in the early 60s. So this is it was a long haul project, and so there was an impression for a while that people would say, she hasn't published much lately, mm-hmm. but she's been doing all sorts of other kinds of social forms of writing, for people, occasional writing for people's birthdays, retirements, things like that. An incredible woman of letters. Keeping up correspondence over decades, a journal writer. So she's been producing in all these different forms that I think are really important literary forms that we want to represent in this collection, because that is literary labor too, that's related to the kind of sociality that Karis is talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Can I invite...
I think I just wanted to add that I think it helps, just to add to what Deanna was saying. I think that I'm really excited, first of all, by this collection. I've always loved Maria Hindmarch's work, and it's to have it be collected and come back, fully into the conversation is really wonderful, and in all these other forms. But I want to say too, even that if she wasn't actively, present in the literary magazines or has a book out every few years or whatever, she was always, if you were ever in Vancouver, she came to all the readings. She nurtured the younger people. When I would go back to Vancouver, she'd come to the reading. After the reading, she had something to say about what you read. She bought the books. She read the books. She, sometimes after readings, if they were in her neighborhood, everybody went back to her house. That's in the Kitsilano poem, it could actually just be called Maria Gladys, and because she creates her own neighborhood where all these things that Deanna were talking about are still happening. It's just the publishing industry missed them.
That's right.
The rest of us,
And what the three
they
of
were
you are
there.
saying is that this is not simply work that gets to count as work, but is essential foundational work.
And that's what we're trying to do,
And
is really
ongoing.
shift.
You would think that would be an obvious point.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, we're trying to shift the lens or shift the focus to look at that type of contribution as foundational, as important. And fortunately, a lot of it was captured on tape. Those group gatherings, the conversations between people.
Right.
And so we see, just to give you maybe two examples, we see, look at me saying see, we hear on the tape, Maria in conversation with Warren Tallman, narrating the history of the Vancouver writing scene, or a history of the Vancouver writing scene. And she is inserting the names of women, she is correcting dates, she is making all kinds of editorial contributions to a text that would eventually, or something that would eventually be produced as an essay published by Warren Tallman. So the tapes give us insight into her work that was not necessarily obvious.
Well, PoemTalk is generally a happy show, but and we've been pretty happy in this conversation, but I'm going to invite the three of you to be more critical and negative if you want. Especially in the U.S., in sort of post-New American poetry circles and scholars interested in that turn, and there's been a fetishization of the Vancouver Conference, and I would invite the three of you, if you want, to say something critical about how that all worked out. I mean, we've already sort of said that here, but I invite you to be more critical. There is a constructive criticism of that here, and it's worth spelling out. So who wants to go first?
I'd be happy to. I think one of the things, to pick up on the last thing I said, is, often we see people talking about the Vancouver Poetry Conference as Creeley, Olson, Duncan. Levertov is occasionally mentioned. Avison is almost never mentioned because she's an inconvenient name in terms of the dominant narrative that people want to talk
Canadian.
about. And she's Canadian. She's Canadian. She's sort of affiliated with Creeley, Creeley's poetics to some extent at the time, but she's very quickly moves away from that. And so the names of, the presence of women, we also know that there were all kinds of women who participated in that conference who were almost never mentioned. Helen Sontoff, Jane Rule, Angela Bowering, and there's a kind of conviviality and sociality behind the events that are talked about, in which women facilitated, participated, etc. And I think you get Hindmarch pointing to that.
I'm inviting everybody to follow on, but I think, Karis just did such a great job. There's almost not much more to say, but there's tons, because this is really an intervention, I think, this poem.
Well, we can maybe say something about Ellen Tallman's work.
Yeah, definitely.
Robert Duncan comes to read in Vancouver as part of the conference, but also he makes a number of other trips. And
the first in 59, I
yeah,
think, right?
Yeah, the first in 59. And it's Ellen Tallman, not Warren Tallman, who has that connection to the Bay Area, who facilitates that invitation. But on the recordings that we've been listening to, she also talks about scripting his reading. So she chooses the poems. She chooses the lineup of poems. She receives him and takes him for coffee. So the reading that he gives, she's behind that. And his whole, his presence in Vancouver is very much facilitated by her. But we hardly ever see any mention of that in the histories. But the tape, she's on tape talking about that work.
Yeah, and she and Gladys are so important for creating this atmosphere of conviviality, which is really the thing that I think people celebrate. And many people who attended the conference were there kind of for the social aspects of it as much as for the poetry.
And to Warren's credit, he knew that and he recognized that as well, right? That she was the person who had that dynamic energy to create those moments, that it wasn't his talent.
I was just going to insert just something about that I thought of and then I forgot and I just remembered again. just about the idea of conviviality too, and the idea of the community that's involved in poesis, in the making, which we end up with a poem on the page, somebody's published it, somebody put their name, maybe not the person who wrote everything in it, but that behind that, this idea of conviviality, the shared pot that gets used for various things, is a non-materialistic, points to a non-materialistic way of life. Like, it's not a society of consumption here. It's not a society of exploitation of people elsewhere so that I can have a car and I can have a shirt. It's the sharing of what we have. And what's the wealth is in the conversation. It's in the poesis. It's in the making. And that, to me, is like, when I learned about this and went there, I was like, that's how I want to live.
Right.
Two kinds of, wow, you're ridiculous. Two kinds of collaborative making. One is the red pot, which is going to be food, and the other is the oak table. Even though she doesn't say that's my writing table, I just get the feeling there's a meta-poetic moment there when she's saying, she's giving us, it was the Bowerings and they brought, she has the whole thing about how it got there, but it's her oak table, but the pronoun her doesn't quite work for it because it's ours, it's theirs. You just explained that oak table.
But she also says that she wrote in a bay window with a board cut to fit in the window. That was her desk.
And no doubt it's the same window that at the end of the poem we're looking up at. So basically we're seeing the writer writing about us. I have one more question which I'd like Karis to start on, and then we'll go around and just offer final thoughts on It's something you came here to say but didn't have a chance to yet. Karis, there's a pedagogy implicit here. I know you do really experimental things with your students, such as go into the room with, I think, actual cassette tapes, which most of them have probably never seen, and I don't know what you do. Do you have them snip the magnetic tape and edit?
Those are the workshops that Deanna and I have done, press play workshops, where yes, these are your invention.
Oh.
We take the tape, we hold the tapes and talk about our relationship to the tapes, and then we destroy them, and then we put them back together.
Which is just part of the whole thing, but there's something, the choice of this poem, I invite you to say something. It would be counterintuitive for a lot of people listening to this conversation. What are the pedagogical implications of Mariah Hindmarch's intervention in the whole question of memory archive, witnessing testimony? Archive meaning largely a sound archive, journals, etc. Why is teaching how can teaching change as a result of what we learn from this?
I mean, for me, the foundation of teaching is the conversation. It is whether you want to call it Socratic dialogue, but I mean, to me, it is about facilitating a conversation. And so, particularly with audio recordings, I think the conversation, my students are actually about to make their own conversations about audio recordings. I think it is a really valuable critical mode, one that is probably even more important for literary audio than the essay. And so I'm interested in how we can stage those conversations in the classroom, but also how students themselves can stage conversations as a contribution to criticism.
Thank you. So, final thoughts. Everyone gets a chance to say something you meant to say but haven't had a chance to yet. Deanna, are you ready for that?
Sure. I just wanted to maybe point to this, one of my favorite moments in the poem, which is this scenario of dancing in my bedroom to music on a tape recorder, dancing in the other bedroom to a transistor radio, 2 bongo drummers in the kitchen, talking in the room with the blue tile fireplace, so many bodies. But I just love, it gives us an almost kind of auditory landscape of all these things happening simultaneously almost in like a Dadaist, like simultaneous poem. But it doesn't, it's very unornamented description, and it sort of just lets the noise of that space filter in without doing too much to it. Just pointing to the experience of having been there and being a part of something that's, indescribable in a way because it has so many facets to it.
Thank you. Erín, final thought?
Well, I'm still into the, being a cook and everything, into the big red pot. and also into, which is making me think of what Deanna was saying in the dancing, people in a small space. And I guess I just wanted to, the poem at the end points out to us and to the future in the way that it ends, but I wanted to point out to the midden that's there in Kitsilano, and that Kitsilano was a member of what we would call a chief, but a member, a man of a very important family in one of the indigenous nations that inhabited that exact area. And it was the CPR, the Canadian Pacific Railway, which fraudulently bought that land from the indigenous people and to create a suburb for rich people outside of the west end of Vancouver. So when I read Kitsilano, I always remember Kitsilano, and he's one of all the West Coast peoples had a ethos of the potlatch, which is the giving away. And I always think of the pot in Kitsilano with this ethos of giving that is continued, in the 60s and 70s, and that hopefully we can continue onwards. I mean, I think Modpo has that, is a potlatch too.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to bring that into the picture.
That's really cool. So the 60s era communitarianism of the Bohemian poets, etc., actually is very historical, and whether it intended or not, was very respectful of the ancestors.
Well, I think the ancestors were kind of feeding it, even if they didn't know they
Right,
were
yeah.
smoking pot, but boiling potlatch.
Karis, you have a final thought?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many lines in here that I just gravitate towards, but the dropping by. I was thinking the other night about this, the idea of spontaneity and that relationship between, I said staging conversations earlier, and I think there is a certain amount of care and construction that goes into making a really good conversation and a good party and a good social space. But there's also spontaneity to it, right, where it's unscripted. And so one of the things I love about this poem is the way that it creates the conditions for community building, but a lot of it is opening the window and saying, hey, do you want to drop by? And so I hope we don't lose that in the creation of those moments, right? And it seems to me that teaching, the institution puts a lot of pressure on us to make things really scripted and really predetermined. And I'm reminded, the value of the spontaneous, unscripted moments.
Forgive me for overstating a response to that, or being too excited about a response to that, but I think our decision to do this in Erin's dining room, and Erin's too modest to even speak to this, but everyone I talk to, I told you this the other night, their reputation is, Erin is so nice, she's so generous with her space, and she's sort of a, one poet, communitarian, hopeful that this kind of thing will keep happening. Mm-hmm. And then I think of our decision this is, despite it being scripted within an inch of its life in terms of its format, this PoemTalk conversation was unprepared. It's spontaneous. So maybe there's like a C+, B- version of what you just said going on in this conversation. And your decision, not me as the producer saying, we're going to talk about this poem. It's you, the two of you, Karis and Deanna, saying, let's do this because it'll raise all these issues. So there's something very meta about it. I have two final thoughts real quick. One is, also a shout out to Karis, because when I got to the gallon of Kelowna Red, I thought of you because it's the only Kelowna I know. You're in Kelowna.
Yes.
K-O-L.
K-E-L.
K-E-L-O-W-N-A,
That's right.
which is 4 or 5 hours east of Vancouver. This is where you live and teach. And Erin taught me before we went on the air that there's Kelowna Red and Kelowna White and gallon. In that era.
Now these don't exist.
It's too expensive probably now, right? But there's grapes being grown out there.
There's over 200 world-class wineries in the Okanagan.
So back in the day,
none of them have anything to do with the jug of Kelowna Red.
Okay, but I mean, there was something about a jug of wine that goes along with the scene here. And actually, my second comment has a lot to do with that, which is the sexy, body-pressing, partying thing that's going on, which either is or isn't something you want to just talk about now with changing attitudes about people pressing bodies against each other at parties because of all the ways in which that can go wrong. The kind of openness about sexuality, but that passage, which is very sexy, is also about the community and it's not about sex in the way the old poets' communities could do it in a way that creates hierarchies and wrongnesses. And I think she reinforces that by when she gets to that part in her recording for you, she leaves Creeley out. She goes downstairs to pee because the line at the bathroom is too long, and it's not her and Creeley, it's just her and someone else. I won't go any further with that other than to say that this is not nostalgic. Even with the Kelowna Red, cheap gown, we all do this, right? I mean, those of us who are maybe, just thinking about the day when Boone's Farm in my neighborhood wine was really cheap and you can get really high and excited very inexpensively. Yes. And, in Greenwich Village, you could pay between $30 and $100 a month and just write, and you can't do that anymore, but the ideas still pertain, and she is not nostalgic about that. She wants us to find our own way to do that.
Yeah, totally.
Well said.
Well, we like to end Poem Talk with a minute or two of Gathering Paradise, which is a chance for several of us, or all of us if we're quick to spread wide our narrow hands, to gather a little something really poetically good, to hail or commend someone or something going on in the poetry world. Who wants to recommend something first? Gather some paradise. Deanna, you must be ready.
Sure. So I would like to recommend Danielle Lafrance's book, Friendly Fire, which came out with Talon Books in 2016. Currently doing some writing about that, and I'm just receiving its gifts every day. Danielle is a poet living and working in Vancouver. She's currently working on a reading series that is sort of talking about where intimacy and sort of social structure meet. It's called #PostDildo, which is really great. She's writing a project that's going to come out as a book afterward and also is going to talk about the conversations that emerged from that reading group. So shout out to Danielle Lafrance.
Thank you. Karis, Gather Some Paradise.
Well, I just learned yesterday about an amazing project coming out of McGill that Miranda Hickman is co-organizing called Poetry Matters. And they are, maybe I won't say too much about it other than it can be found online on the McGill website. And it's, they'll be adjudicating a fairly large poetry prize that
a fairly large
poetry
We're just
prize.
Going to dangle that out there to people who listen to this. Okay.
And you can use the interweb to look it up.
Okay, great.
Poetry
Erín,
Matters.
Gather Some Paradise. By the way, you're Paradise.
Oh,
You are.
I don't know.
Isn't she Paradise?
I don't know. But anyway.
You're so modest. Just say you're Paradise and we'll move on.
Okay. And next case. But I just wanted to point out that in the spirit of poesis and making and things that happen in making is to follow Lisa Robertson's Instagram feed, which is Office of Architecture, because not only do you have images of fabrics, meals, cheeses, and trees and things, but she takes screenshots of her work, the Baudelaire Fractal, which will probably appear, I think, and be finished and appear at the end of next year, maybe the beginning of the following year probably from Coach House. I don't know, I'm just inventing all that, but you can watch her creating a work kind of in real time and see some of the just some still images from what she's written that day. So that's pretty
What's
amazing.
her Instagram handle? Is it
It's
just like
Office
Lisa?
for Soft Architecture. But if you look her up, either as Lisa Robertson or Office for Soft Architecture. I don't know if her page is closed or you have to be invited or not. I forget. But
No, on Instagram, I don't think you have that option.
some
You do, but I think it's open.
I have two quick Gathering Paradises. One is Drawn and Quarterly Bookstore. Deanna and we filmed a ModPo Plus video there, two of them actually. And Michael Nardone had brought us there, and I just think it's great. And a shout out to if you're ever in Montreal, anybody who's listening to this, or if you live in Montreal and you haven't been there, Drawn and Quarterly, you should go. And the second is, I recently reread to prepare to hang out a little bit with Erín Moure during this extended visit to Montreal, Planetary Noise, the poetry of Erín Moure, and I just want to shout that out. Wesleyan, 2017. You have to read it. I imagine that you yourself I'm so glad you're mic'd because you're probably going to want to say something, that you yourself had to go through the exercise of someone else choosing poems to create a sense of the arc of your work from the 70s to now. And there it is. And it's remarkable for the rest of us, with a great introduction.
By Shannon McGuire. I just want to
Shannon's
speak her
fantastic
name.
introduction. I'm sure you winced, like, oh, how is she going to make generalizations? Because it's very brief. But wow, what a sense of the arc of the work. And for the first time, your readers, instead of having to find this, that, and the other thing, this book here, we're starting to get a sense of the whole movement. So I just gathered some paradise.
Lucky me. She wants to say.
You are so funny. Well, that's all the gallon jugs of Kelowna Red we have time for on PoemTalk today. PoemTalk at the Writers' House is a collaboration of the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing and the Kelly Writers' House at the University of Pennsylvania and the Poetry Foundation, poetryfoundation.org. Thanks so much to my guests, Erín Moure, Karis Shearer, and Deanna Fong, and again to Erín for hosting us at her place, and to PoemTalk's directors and engineers today, my traveling colleagues, Chris Martin, Anna Strong-Safford, and Zach Cardner. Snaps for them, right? And to Zach, who is, for this and all episodes, PoemTalk's editor. Next, and a shout out, I forgot to almost say, this is very important, a shout out to Nathan and Elizabeth Light for their very generous support of PoemTalk. In our next episode, back in Philadelphia, I'll be joined by another Montrealer, Angela Carr, and also by Anna Vitale and Maithili Jagannathan to talk about Divya Victor's poem, W is for Walt Whitman's Soul. This is Al Filreis, and I hope you'll join us for that or another episode of PoemTalk.